So given how I scheduled the classes, this wasn't on purpose, but for me, today is a controversial topic day. In the morning, I lectured on IQ tests in 1200, and in 1100 today, the topic is genetics and evolutionary psychology. So this is the weird one that's slapped on at the end of the loose leaf, so it's after the index. So it's taken from a different textbook, but slapped on at the end. So the chapter starts off with some basic terms from genetics. A lot of these will be reviewed for many of you, but it's good to go over. So DNA is inside every cell, and it's the kind of instruction manual for building proteins, which in turn build our bodies. And it's crucial to keep in mind how this works, so we will talk about the ways in which genes influence different behavioral and psychological traits, but it's not like genes exert mind control or something. They build our bodies and brains, and then our bodies and brains are what cause behavior. So, very important distinction is the distinction between the genotype and the phenotype of an animal. So the genotype is all of the genes that you have. So if you sequenced your DNA, you found out what all the letters were, that would be your genotype. The phenotype is all of the traits that you have. So the genotype influences the phenotype, but doesn't 100% determine it. So a part of your phenotype would be how tall you are, what color your eyes are. Those are simple cases, but also psychological and behavioral traits. How aggressive you are, how disposed to being happy you are. And again, none of these will be 100% determined by the genotype, but the genotype will influence them in various ways. So there are the letters of the DNA code, and by letter, of course, I mean different types of molecules. There's 4. Strips of DNA that code for proteins are called genes. And then big units of genes are called chromosomes. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, so 46 total. 23 from mom and 23 from dad. A very important tool in the arsenal of behavior geneticists is different types of twins. We'll return to this a bit later. When a sperm hits an egg, that entity is called a zygote. So a zygote is a fertilized egg. There are monozygotic or identical twins, and dizygotic or non-identical or fraternal twins. Monozygotic twins come from a single zygote, so they share 100% of their DNA, and dizygotic twins come from separate sperm and eggs, so 2 different zygotes, hence dizygotic, and they share 50% of their DNA, the same as siblings, as ordinary siblings. When looking at different psychological traits, there's a particular pattern of inheritance that you'll often see, which is Mendelian inheritance. This is named after Gregory Mendel, who is the founder of genetics. These are really simple cases where you have single genes for traits, but they can conflict. So the simple case that's often used in the textbooks is genes for eye color. This is an oversimplification, but this is the Mendelian pattern. You can have a gene for brown eyes and a gene for blue eyes. If the genes conflict, one of the genes will be dominant, and one will be recessive. And if the genes conflict, the dominant one is the one that wins, so to speak. So, in the standard example, brown eye genes are dominant. So if you inherit a brown eye gene from dad and a blue eye gene from mom, you will likely have brown eyes. In order to have the blue eye trait, you need both of the recessive genes. So you need a blue eye gene from mom and a blue eye gene from dad. Now that simplistic picture almost never applies to human psychological traits. Human psychological traits are almost always polygenic. Polygenic means influenced by many genes. So poly means many, so that's where it comes from. And not just psychological traits, some physical traits too. Height is a classic example. Height is very heritable, so twins raised apart are very similar for height, but there's not a single height gene or even a handful of height genes. It's many, many genes, each exerting a small influence. Traits that are polygenic can still be subject to selective breeding. So here's a picture from the book. If it loads. Okay, well, the book gives an example, which hopefully comes up in a second. You can take a sample of, I think it's rats that they take. Some animal. Yes, it's rats. So, and you look at how good they are at solving the maze. So it starts off here. So the further they are this way, the fewer errors they make when solving the maze. So the quote, smarter rats are more over here. And selective breeding is you take rats that, so if you want to breed for rats to be better at a maze, you would take the rats that do well and have them reproduce. And so that's what they did. They would take a group of rats that did well and have them reproduce, and a group of rats that didn't do well and have them reproduce. You do this generation after generation, and what you get is this difference where the rats that you've bred to be better at it do in fact do better. So that's a simple case. As we'll see later, this was actually an analogy that Darwin drew upon when putting forward his theory of natural selection. With natural selection, it's not human breeders doing it, but the environment. Right? So like my example on the first day of class, if the environment is white, it will select for white fur, because the animals that don't have white fur die younger and leave fewer descendants. Not tragically, obviously it's good, the ethics boards don't let us do that with humans. We can't do selective breeding experiments with humans, so we have to rely on other measures. And so some we've already talked about back in chapter 1, which is twin studies. So I'll review what I said in that section. So there's two types of twin studies. One is where you take monozygotic twins that are raised apart, and look at how similar they are for different traits. So you can measure the degree of correlation between identical twins for IQ, for personality, for likelihood of winding up in prison, for likelihood of getting divorced, whatever you like, and look at how strong the correlation is. The other method that we talked about is you can compare the similarity of identical twins and non-identical twins that are raised in the same family. So in that case, both sets of twins share the home environment, but the identical twins share twice as many genes, and so they should be more similar if genes contribute to variation in the trait. So there's actually an equation for doing this, for calculating the heritability of a trait based on the difference in correlation. I won't test you on it or tell you, but if you're curious, you can ask during office hours or something. There's another kind of study that involves adoption, but not the adoption of twins, just standard adoption cases. You look at kids who are adopted, and you look at how similar they are to their biological parents, and how similar they are to their adoptive parents. So if they're more similar to their biological parents, that's evidence for a genetic contribution to the trait, whereas the extent to which they are similar to their adoptive parents is evidence for the home environment influencing the trait. So we have these various methods, and they lead to a number called heritability, or a quantity called heritability. This is a very important concept, and it's very easy to misunderstand. So heritability ranges from 0 to 1, or you could say 0 to 100%. In the articles, it'll be 0 to 1. And it's an estimate of how much of the variation in a trait is due to genes. So, for example, to take a very strongly heritable example, height is 80 to 90% heritable. Not very surprising. But there are several caveats I want to add to this. Number one, heritability is about differences or variation. So it's tempting to hear, oh, okay, height is 90% heritable, and think, oh, that means like this much of my height is due to genes or something silly like that. But it's about differences. So the example I used this morning in my 1200 class, if we took everyone in this class and ranked them from shortest to tallest, there would be differences, right? So there's variation in that trait. How much of those differences are due to genes? How much of the variation is due to genes? So that's very important. Another one is it's about individual differences. It's not about group differences. Whenever people hear about the nature-nurture debate or genetic differences, their mind goes straight to race or ethnicity, and that's not what these numbers are about. They're about differences between individuals. Group differences is a separate topic that we actually don't really have good methods for measuring in the same way. So I talk more about that in 1200 in the IQ chapters, but I'll just see. For now, you'll have to take my word for it, but you can watch lectures from that chapter if you're interested. Okay, another caveat. Heritability can change based on the environment. So these numbers are not fixed like laws of physics. So one example that I was talking about again this morning, IQ, if you use the standard methods, is something like 50 to 70% heritable, more than a lot of other traits in psychology. But that number is not fixed. It's lower in impoverished communities. So if you look at if you measure the heritability of IQ in people who are low socioeconomic status, it's lower. And the idea there is, if you're in an impoverished environment, you're not reaching your full genetic potential, and so there's less genetic contribution to variation in the trait. Right? Genes are explaining less of what's going on if the environment is malnourished in some way. So heritability is not fixed. And last one, it does not tell you about mechanism. Another way of saying that is, it doesn't tell you how the gene influences the trait. So you look at identical twins raised apart, they are substantially similar. Well, that's got to be due to genes, because they don't share their home environment, but they do share genes. But how those genes contribute to the trait, we don't know. So one possibility is it could happen like this. It could be that there's a gene that contributes to one trait, which then elicits a response from the environment which then produces another trait, trait 2. So again, those of you in my 1200 class, you've already heard this, but another trait that we know is heritable is extroversion, so how outgoing and socially confident you are. But we don't know that the genes are directly shaping the brain or something like that. It could be that what's actually heritable, what's actually passed on genetically, is a different trait. Maybe being good looking is the example I use. So maybe the genes make you better looking. And then if you're better looking, how does the environment respond? Well, it treats you better. When you talk to people, they're more pleasant with you. And as a result, you feel more confident about talking to people. So the response from the environment is then what produces extroversion. So if that example is confusing, just remember the heritability numbers don't tell you how the genes produce the trait. So, having given all those caveats, what do we find when we do these twin studies and other studies? So, people have done these twin studies on all sorts of psychological traits for many decades. And in the year 2000, the behavior geneticist Eric Turkheimer wrote a paper with a provocative first sentence. The first sentence of that paper was, "The nature-nurture debate is over." He was being kind of deliberately provocative, but what he was talking about was well-replicated patterns from this body of evidence. Now, there's complexities in that paper that we won't get into, but I'll summarize what he says there. He put forward what have come to be known as the 3 laws of behavior genetics. These are in the key terms, and they're good to know. Now, these are not laws in the strict sense of like a law of physics, but they're very well replicated. The first law is everything, or damn near almost everything, in psychology is heritable. Typically, around 40 to 50%. Now, some are a little bit lower, like political attitudes, maybe 30% heritable. Still not zero, though. Identical twins are similar in political attitudes in a measurable way. As I say, IQ is a bit more, height is much more, but most traits in psychology are around 40 to 50% heritable. If you find a twin study and want to bet, you should bet 40 to 50%. Okay, before I guess as I build up to 2 and 3, I have to distinguish between 2 different types of environmental influence. People sometimes speak loosely about the environment. Behavior geneticists distinguish between the shared environment and the non-shared environment. Someone from 1200, what's the shared environment?
The environment in which people share.
Who shares?
Of the either the identical twins or non-identical twins.
Close. So just siblings. So siblings who live together. So the environment shared by siblings raised together. That's what shared means. So this would include, the home you grow up in, what school you go to, the neighborhood in which you live. Those are things that are typically shared by siblings. The non-shared environment is everything else. So every source of variation that's not genes and that's not the shared environment is the non-shared environment. So, think of like friend groups, right? So you can have niche friend groups. There can be random events in your education that influence who you are. You have a fist fight with someone, you get hit in the head really hard. That technically is part of the environment. It's something that can influence your subsequent traits, but it's not genes and not the shared environment. In my experience, when I talk to people about this, most people are not that surprised by the first law. And it makes sense that traits would be around half genetic, or at least the variance in those traits. The really surprising thing is in laws 2 and 3. If you use these types of methods, you find that the effect of the shared environment is almost always small. If you have to bet, usually 0 to 20% of the variance. Whereas the effect of the non-shared environment is large, typically 40 to 50%. So how do we go about concluding that? So for the shared environment, one thing you can do is look at adoptive siblings. So these are siblings who share none of their genes, but all of their home or shared environment. So different biological parents, but the same adoptive parents. How similar are they when they grow up? And the answer is not very similar for most traits that you can measure, especially when they grow up. The effect is a bit larger when they're still living at home, which kind of makes sense. By the time they grow up, very often, if you look at these papers, the estimate of the contribution of the shared environment is literally 0. You'll see that quite often. There are some exceptions. So 2 well-replicated exceptions are education and religiosity. The home environment does have a big effect on those, which kind of makes sense. But for most psychological traits that you can measure, the effect of the shared environment is small. Now, if that seems really surprising to you, because again, most people, I think, when they hear environment or nurture, assume that it's things like how your parents raise you. But here's something that might help to move your intuitions on that. Think about the children of immigrants, specifically the children of immigrants who are born in the country that parents immigrate to. So people in that situation, their parents, so let's say it's immigrating to Canada, the parents will speak with an accent if they speak English at all. Their peers do not speak English with an accent. Who do the kids wind up sounding like? The parents or the peers? The peers. Almost always the peers. So that's an example of a way in which factors in the environment outside of the home have a bigger impact than factors inside the home. And the statistics bear that out. I mean, slightly different example, but it should pump your intuitions. Any questions about the 3 laws? There are interesting examples from this line of research of what are called gene-environment interactions. One really interesting one has to do with that method I talked about where you look at adopted children, you look at how similar they are to their biological parents and their adoptive parents. Often, these studies use the biological father, and there's actually a specific reason for that. Can anyone guess? There's a big confounding variable if you use the biological mother. So let's say you look at how similar an adopted kid is to the biological mother as a way of measuring how much genes influence a trait. What's the confounding variable?
Is it because the mother carried them for 9 months?
Yeah, the mother carried them for 9 months, and different things in the environment may influence what that process is like. So if the mother's more poor, for example, that could explain some of the correlation between the mother and the child, whereas the father, all the father contributes is the genes. So one interesting study looked at likelihood of engaging in criminal behavior. And they look at cases where, to put it crudely, there's a violent adoptive father. So the adoptive father has a history of criminal behavior. Cases where there's just a violent biological father. So the biological father has a history of criminal behavior. Or the really unlucky kids who have both. The kids who have, bad luck. Biological father with a history of violence and an adoptive father with a history of violence. And what you find is kids with a violent adoptive father alone have no extra risk of engaging in violent criminal behavior. Just a violent bio father, some extra risk, not much. You'd have to look it up to get the exact number, but not very much extra risk. But the kids who have both, a lot of extra risk. So having the violent adoptive father by itself doesn't really increase the risk unless you also have the genetic risk to start off with. So that's an example of a gene-environment interaction. I think it's listed in the key terms. Okay, let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh yes, okay, so these findings, especially law number 2, it had been in the literature for a long time, but it was popularized by a writer named Judith Rich Harris. A lot of people were really outraged by this because people wanted to believe that they had more of an effect on their kids than that, more of a long-term effect. And also, people like blaming their parents for different things too. A lot of Freudian psychoanalysis is predicated on the idea that psychopathology emerges from how your parents treat you. And I will say, behavior geneticists usually add the caveat that here we're talking about normal range variation. When you're talking about extremes of abuse or neglect, yes, you can have a big effect on your kids. Think about height, right? Height is very strongly genetically influenced. If you starve your kid, yes, he or she will be shorter than he otherwise would have been. But when we're talking about normal range variation, the effect of parenting is probably small. So, I apologize for the swear words, but there's a funny poem in that book by Judith Rich Harris. So she's quoting a poem about how parents mess you up, and then she writes a response poem, and they're both kind of amusing. So here's the parents mess you up poem. They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They don't mean to, but they do. They fill you with all the faults they had and add some extra just for you. So that's the poem that already existed. But Judith Rich Harris said, no, that's not right. Here's the right poem. How sharper than a serpent's tooth to hear your child make such a fuss. It isn't fair, it's not the truth. He's fucked up, yes, but not by us. So that was her response to that. And one thing she says too in that book that I think is good to keep in mind, because what many people say in response to this is, well, if I don't have that much of a long-term effect on my kids, why should I treat them well? Which is kind of a strange thing to ask when you think about it. What her response is, think about being married. So probably most of you are not married. Hopefully none of you have the delusion that when you get married, you will change the personality of your spouse. It's not really how it usually works. But you would not, and you could, suppose there was a study that showed that in fact you don't influence the personality of your spouse. No one would conclude from that, so I should treat my spouse like crap. Like, no, you treat people well because they are human relationships. And of course, I added the caveat that some things parenting does have a larger influence on, education being one of them. So I'm not saying there's nothing they influence, but probably for many traits, the influence is smaller than we'd think. Okay. Any other questions before I show the video? So to talk more about these patterns, I have a video from the psychologist Steven Pinker. If you asked psychologists, who's the most important living psychologist, many of them would be offended by the question, but if you press them, Steven Pinker would be a defensible answer. And I'll show a video of him talking about some of these effects. Okay, so towards the end, he may have overstated it a bit. Sometimes it's true that the adoptive siblings wind up not similar at all. For some traits, that's right, but as I mentioned, there is some amount of variation there. One funny thing that I'll also add, he says this in other talks, he sometimes makes the quip that there's a technical term for people who believe that genes play no role in influencing human differences and that all differences are from how you're raised. The technical term for such people is childless. And the idea is, as soon as you have more than one kid, as Pinker says there, you realize that they kind of come into the world different. And I think if you have siblings, that'll be consistent with your experience. Even though that you both share all of your upbringing, siblings wind up very different. A growing new area of research has to do with what's called epigenetics. Have any of you heard the term epigenetics? A handful. So, it's very important to distinguish epigenetics, which is a newly discovered or newly exploding as an area of research, and a different process that a lot of people confuse with it, which is mutations. So the letters of the DNA code are A, C, T, G. These each stand for different molecules. So let's say there's a strip of DNA that looks like this. A mutation would be one of these changes. So like due to an error in copying, the T becomes an A. There are different ways that can happen. Cosmic ray hits it, some glitch, whatever. Different letter now. Mutations are the raw ingredients of evolution by natural selection. Mutations are what introduce new genetic variants that then can be subject to selection. Right? Some of those mutations, in fact most, will either be harmful or do nothing, but some percentage of them will happen to be beneficial, they'll be suited to the environment, and those are the mutations that will spread or that will increase in frequency. Epigenetics is when the letters of the code don't change, but how they're expressed changes. And this is caused by the environment. So the environment can affect you in such a way that different genes are expressed. And crucially, those can be passed on too, those epigenetic changes. So here's a concrete example. My grandfather served in World War II. He came in towards the end, didn't really see much action. Little history aside, when the Western Allies were fighting the Nazis, the Canadians had the job of liberating the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, or also called Holland, was occupied by Nazi Germany, and the Canadians were the ones who went there. During the war, the Nazis took a lot of the food from Holland for the war effort, and this came to be known as the Dutch famine. There was a lot of starvation in Holland, and one of my grandfather's most vivid memories was of kids eating their hair because everyone was so hungry. This made a difference to the babies who, if their mother was pregnant with them during the Dutch famine, they had a higher likelihood of being obese later in life. And the idea is, it's not like that experience changed their genes, but it changed how they were expressed. In particular, it led to them, more likely to try and store fat from food. And that can be passed on to their kids as well. Epigenetic changes, even though they're not to the letters of DNA, can still be passed on multiple generations down. They've done this with rats, where you stress one rat out or one group of rats and don't stress the other group out, and this results in changes in the stress system that can even be seen generations later. So a very interesting area of research. Does the logic of it make sense? Any questions about these terms? So the remaining part of the chapter, a little over half, is about evolutionary psychology. So the first third or so of the chapter is about genetics, and then the rest is about evolutionary psychology. And this is maybe the most controversial part of the book, certainly one of the most. There are different reasons why evolutionary psychology is controversial. I think I may have mentioned this in chapter 1. So some religious people, of course, object to evolution. I'll just say, for whatever it's worth, I was raised in such a family. I was raised to believe evolution was not true. I wasn't planning on telling this story, but I distinctly remember I was in Costa Rica, and I was reading about it, considering the evidence for evolution, trying to reconcile it with my faith at the time. And we were going ziplining, and at the bottom of the zip line there was a monkey cage, and we had the opportunity to hold monkeys in our hands and play with them or whatever. And I remember touching the monkey's foot, and I thought, shit, that feels exactly like my foot. Maybe there's something to this evolution business. So that's one line of objection. Many people who are on the what you might call the secular left don't like some of the implications of evolutionary psychology because it implies, for example, that some sex differences in psychology are biologically based. And to be fair, others object on scientific grounds. There are concerns with whether these hypotheses are testable. You can't go back in time and look at the selection pressure in action. So there are various controversies related to evolutionary psychology. As I said in chapter 1, you're not required to believe anything to do well. You just have to understand what the theories say. Personally, I'm very sympathetic to evolutionary psychology. No research program is perfect, but I think it does offer a lot of insight. I'm going to start with a basic fact. 99% of all organisms that have ever lived have no living descendants today. They left no descendants that are still with us. Some species go extinct, mass extinction events. Some organisms, don't find a mate, or they die in childhood. For all sorts of reasons, some organisms have left no descendants. But So, and that's to say, they failed the evolutionary game. 99% lost the evolutionary game. But not a single one of your ancestors lost the evolutionary game. Because you're here, so obviously they left descendants. Part of the logic of evolution is, there are differences between those that won the game and those that lost the game, and those differences matter. So, as I said in chapter 1, natural selection has 3 ingredients. Variation. I may have used slightly different words, but it's the same idea. Variation, inheritance, and differential reproduction. And by that last one, I just mean, differences in reproductive success. Once you have these 3 ingredients, you get natural selection. So variation just means there are differences. So organisms will vary, they'll differ in various ways. And as I already mentioned, that's introduced by mutations. So the differences that exist emerge through random changes in DNA. You need some mechanism for those various traits to be passed on. So that's the inheritance bit. And some of those traits have to be better than others at getting the organisms to spread their genes. Some organisms have to leave more descendants than others. So, like I said in chapter 1, think of the polar bear, right? So bears migrate to climates with snow. If any of them happen to have white fur mutations, those animals will leave more descendants than those that don't. Okay, so a few things we have to talk about here, because when I talk about heritability, I had to kind of rule out a number of misunderstandings. We have to do the same thing here. There's a number of, I misspelled inheritance. That's embarrassing. There should be an N there too. Inheritance, not inheritance. One time in Alberta, I was lecturing on intelligence and misspelled heritability and only noticed later. It's not good. So one crucial thing that the book goes out of its way to say is evolution has no foresight. Evolution is a blind process. It cannot look ahead and see what's coming and shape organisms in accordance with that. So I think the example I used on Tuesday with my other 1100 class is global warming. The world's getting hotter. Let's say it's going to be X amount hotter in 100 years. Evolution cannot look ahead and make the animals ready for it. Right? All it can do, because it's a blind process. Another mistake, maybe an even more important mistake, is genetic determinism. So this is false. I guess I should, here, let's do it like this. Bad ideas. So the idea that evolution has foresight is a bad idea. And so is genetic determinism, which is the idea that genes 100% determine everything. So that's false. There are no traits in psychology that are 100% genetically determined. It's tempting to think, we're saying that a certain thing, there's a genetic propensity for it, therefore it's inevitable or there's nothing we can do about it, but again, that's wrong. So one thing we'll talk about in this chapter is there's a lot of evidence that males are on average more disposed to prefer casual sexual encounters than females are. But that does not mean that it's inevitable, that there's nothing you can do about it. Right? If you're in a committed relationship, you may say, I'm going to rebel against any of those tendencies if they're there. An example I used at the U of A, even though the sex drive is natural, some people choose to be celibate. You know, the Catholic Church has priests who are usually celibate. You know, maybe I shouldn't put it quite like that, but so let's just say it's not 100% determined or inevitable. Another mistake is the naturalistic fallacy. And this is the idea that because something is natural, therefore it's good, like morally good. To say that a particular tendency is natural is not to say that it's good. So this arrow is a mistake. There are lots of tendencies that we have that we may, upon reflection, decide to reject. You know, I have no doubt that humans have aggressive and tribalistic impulses that have been bred into us by evolution, but that doesn't mean we have to say, oh, well, nothing we can do about it. We may decide, no, those are morally bad. Okay. Any questions about anything I've said so far in EvPsych? Okay, next I'm going to distinguish between two types of explanation. The first one, there's multiple ways of saying it, so I'll just prepare you in case you see it in the literature. So the book calls it distal explanations. You'll sometimes see the phrase ultimate explanations, or more straightforwardly, you can call it an evolutionary explanation. So those are synonyms in this context. So that's one type. And the other type is proximate explanation. So before I define each, I'll give a concrete example. Suppose there's a guy named Bob. Bob is very common in my examples. So Bob sees a woman named Susan and decides to ask her on a date. He goes up to Susan and asks her on a date. Why did Bob ask her on a date? If you answer in terms of proximate explanations, you will appeal to things in the immediate context. Things in his brain, his hormones, smells in the environment, whatever. Any of that will fall under the umbrella of proximate explanations. So if you say he asked her out because of his testosterone levels or because of his nucleus accumbens, that's proximate explanation. So causes in the immediate context. But you can ask a different question. You can ask, why is it that people do things like ask people on dates at all? Why are these tendencies built into us? If you ask that, you're asking it about distal or ultimate explanation. So the idea there would be, look, anyone who didn't have genes that predisposed them to, have sexual desire, they didn't pass on their genes, so we are the descendants of people who did things like ask people on dates. And it's important to remember these are distinct because I will say at various points in this chapter that people do X, Y, and Z because it was evolutionarily advantageous. But that does not mean people are consciously thinking, yes, I'm going to go ask Susan out because it will increase my chance of spreading my genes. What he's immediately, maybe some guys do think that, but the kinds of things he's immediately thinking about fall under the umbrella of proximate explanation. What he's immediately thinking is probably just, oh, or whatever, right? So he doesn't need to be explicitly thinking about this. That's not the way it works. I mean, one example that's kind of funny, one tendency, so Pinker mentioned some things that are cross-culturally universal. One thing that is cross-culturally universal is incest aversion. People do not like the idea of being intimate with their close family members. Now, there's a very easy evolutionary story to tell about why that is. Does anyone know why? Why has evolution sculpted us to not like sleeping with close family members. It causes dysfunctions, it causes problems, right? So the deleterious effects of inbreeding, right? When you produce a child with someone who's genetically close to you, the kid is going to have problems and therefore is less likely to pass on his or her genes. So that's the evolutionary explanation. But if you ask someone, hey man, your sister's really hot. Why aren't you, doing something about it? The guy's not going to say, well, according to the logic of evolution, it will decrease my chance. What he's going to say is, oh, that's disgusting. What do you mean? So his disgust reaction is approximate explanation. The fact that that tendency is there because of evolution is an ultimate or distal explanation. Okay, hopefully that makes that distinction clear. Any questions about this? Crucially, there can be traits that used to be adaptive that no longer are. The term for this the book uses is vestigial. So something that's vestigial is something that was once adaptive but no longer is. So some debate about this, but like the appendix, that you can get removed, many argue that that's an example of a vestigial organ. It once served an adaptive purpose, but no longer does. Now it's just carried along for the ride. Another important idea to keep in mind that we're going to spend a lot of time on is the distinction between an adaptation and a byproduct. So I'll start with adaptation. Actually, have we taken a break yet? We have not, right? It's 4:30. Okay, I'll explain the distinction between these two, and then we'll take a break. An adaptation is a trait produced, or I should say, a trait selected for by natural selection because of the advantage it conferred on the organisms. So it's a trait selected for by natural selection because of the advantage it conferred on the organism. So in my polar bear example, the white fur is an adaptation. The fact that the white fur is widespread in the population, it's widespread because it helped the animal hide from prey and therefore get more food. All sorts of things are adaptations, right? The heart is an adaptation. It's designed to pump blood. The umbilical cord is an adaptation. It's designed to give food to the fetus. A byproduct is a side effect of an adaptation. So it's something that serves no functional role. It's not doing anything adaptive, but it's, as a side effect, produced by an adaptation. So I said that the umbilical cord is an adaptation. The belly button is a byproduct. Most people have belly buttons. I say most because I had a gay friend who said that he was once with someone who didn't have a belly button, so apparently it's possible to not have one. But most people have belly buttons, but belly buttons serve no functional role. They're not there to attract mates or gather food. It's just a side effect of having an umbilical cord. So what this means is not all traits are adaptive or selected for in that way. In the case of psychology, one thing that might be a byproduct is music. So there's debate about this, but all cultures have music. Most people like music. And people have tried to concoct pretty goofy ideas about why music was adaptive, but it's possible that it's just a byproduct of various other adaptations. So we emotionally respond to certain sounds So for example, sounds with deep resonance produce fear because if an animal is larger, it makes a deeper noise. Of course, we're designed to respond emotionally to the sounds of infants for various reasons. And it could be that music just tickles those emotional responses in different ways. But our enjoyment of music itself might not actually be an adaptation. Okay. Any questions before we take a break? So on Tuesday, I was pretty tight for time. We'll take maybe a somewhat shorter break. So let's come back at 4:40. Okay. To start the next section, so we're now going to zoom into adaptations. And but before that, I'm going to do a little activity, or we are going to do a little activity. I want you to imagine that I have 4 cards on the table, and I'm going to tell you 2 things about these cards. The first one is definitely true. The second one may or may not be true. The first one is that every card has a letter on one side and a number on the other side. So that one you can take to be true. The second one is that if there's a vowel on one side, then there is an even number on the other side. That second one may or may not be true. And let me just do the ones I have here. And so here are the cards facing up. A, D, 4, and 7. I'll make that a crisper. So those are the 4 cards. Here's the question. Which cards would you have to flip over to figure out whether number 2 is true? So again, the idea is if there's a vowel on one side, then there's an even number on the other side. So show of hands, who thinks we have to flip A? Who thinks we have to flip D? Who thinks we have to flip 4? Who thinks we have to flip 7? So everyone got it wrong. I did too. It's a little bit of a trick. Well, not trick, I mean the logic is sound, but the correct answer is A and 7. So here's why. So most people get A right. 4 leads people astray. So let's think through this. So the first one's right. Yeah, like if there's a vowel on one side, there's an even number on the other side. Obviously, we have to flip it. So that goes without saying. D, no possible relevance. D's out. Okay, now what about 4? Suppose we flip it over and it's a vowel. Okay, that's fine. Suppose we flip it over and it's a consonant. Does that matter? And the answer is no, because the rule is if there's a vowel, then there's an even number. The rule is not if there's an even number, then there's a vowel. So whatever's on the other side of 4, it's fine, it doesn't matter. So you actually gain no information about the rule by flipping 4 over. But 7, if you flip it over and there's a vowel, then the rule is wrong. So 7 you have to flip over. So most people get this wrong. It's like a difficult logical puzzle. Now, I'm going to give you a different logical problem with the same logical structure, but it's much easier. So again, there's 4 cards, but each of them has a person, or corresponds to a person, and it has an age and a drink, type of drink. Or I guess I'll say drink first. It has a drink and an age. So that's 1. The second one that may or may not be true is if they have alcohol, then they are over 18. Or I guess, sorry, I'm used to living in Alberta, over 19. So the rule is, if they have alcohol, then they are over 19. And here are the cards. Beer, Coke, like Coca-Cola, not cocaine. 16 and 35. So, the rule is if it's alcohol, they have to be over 19. Which cards do we have to flip over to see if the rule is being followed? Who thinks we have to flip the beer card? Who thinks we have to flip the Coke card? Who thinks we have to flip the 16-year-old? Who thinks we have to flip the 35-year-old? Right, so this time we got it right. Now it's a little unfair because you had practice with the first one, but if you give it to people, in two different groups, people do much better in the second version. So this connects to the next distinction I want to talk about, which is two different types of adaptations that we can have. And my Tuesday class had some trouble with this. It's helpful to think of this distinction not as a sharp distinction, but as existing on a continuum. So, adaptation. And they can exist from, on one end, being very domain specific, to, on the other end, being very domain general. A domain-specific adaptation is one that is designed to deal with a specific kind of problem. So one example is facial recognition. So humans are very good at recognizing faces. There's actually specific parts of the brain devoted to this. So there's a part of the temporal lobe called the fusiform face area. Now, a domain-specific adaptation doesn't have to have a specific brain part devoted to it, but it's an easy example to think about. It's domain-specific because it's about one thing, recognizing faces. A domain general adaptation might be something like the ability to be conditioned by the environment, or the ability to be punished. So we have a very general tendency that goes as follows. If we do something and something unpleasant happens, we are less likely to do that thing again. So if I say something to someone and they yell at me, okay, I'm not going to say that kind of thing anymore. If I touch the hot stove and it hurts, I'm going to stop doing that. So it applies to many different domains, hence domain general. The example I just showed with the two different logic problems is relevant to debates about human reasoning. What kind of adaptation is human reasoning? Some people think that reasoning is very, this might mislead you for one of the questions. But I'll just say some people think we have a general ability to reason. We can reason about any problem equally well. To the extent that that's true, reasoning would be a more domain general adaptation. But those in evolutionary psychology typically think that we don't have just the generic ability to reason, we have lots of specific problem-solving adaptations. So for example, we have the ability to think about rules, social rules, and that's like one kind of adaptation. So hence the alcohol example is easy for us because it's an adaptation that we have. We're used to and designed by evolution to be able to think about that. Because the logical structure of the two problems is the same. It's just that one is in a domain that we're more ready to think about. Does this distinction make sense? any questions about the difference between a domain general adaptation and a domain specific one. Okay, this is in kind of a weird order, but just a couple other terms we have to go through. One that the book talks about is genetic drift. So, genetic drift is a way that gene frequencies can change without natural selection. So in standard cases we've been talking about, a trait becomes more common in a population because it gets selected for. With genetic drift, here's a simple example. Suppose there's a pond with ducks, and the ducks are of varying colors, and there's a couple of red ducks, and they migrate over to a new pond where there's no ducks, and they start making baby ducks. And within a few generations, all the ducks in that new pond have red feathers. No natural selection, it's just there are certain properties that the founders of that new population happen to have, and then they populate the area, and so in that new area, the red feathered genes are more common, but not because of natural selection, simply because of genetic drift. There's then a section on what the book calls species-typical behaviors. So an older term for this is instinct. Instinct is kind of a loaded term, so we prefer to speak of species-typical behavior. These are behaviors that are shared by all or almost all of the members of a species. So Pinker mentioned this in the video. One example that I talked about in 1200, I guess a couple weeks ago, is emotional expression. The book, this chapter talks about it too. There's a lot of evidence that there are about 6 basic facial expressions that are common to all of the world's cultures. In one of the most famous studies, Paul Ekman went to tribal people in Papua New Guinea who had never seen a camera or a movie. They had virtually no contact with the outside world. And he would ask them, show me the face you would make if your child died. And it's the same face you would see here. They made like a sad expression. Show me the face you would make if you were about to fight someone. They make the angry face. So those types of emotional expressions would be species-typical behaviors. Now, the fact that a behavior is species typical doesn't necessarily mean it's 100% programmed in. Sometimes what is programmed in is biological preparedness. Which means there are some things that are easier to learn, that the brain still has to learn it. You still have to receive the right kind of conditioning from the environment, but you're very ripe to learn it, very inclined to learn it. One example of something that's biologically prepared is different kinds of fears, like fear of snakes and spiders. It's worth reflecting on that even in urban areas in North America, where spiders and snakes are, especially dangerous ones, don't really exist, people are much more likely to be afraid of snakes and spiders than they are of cars, guns, or knives, even though those are more likely to kill you in a modern urban environment. And there's a funny study that illustrates how biological preparedness works. They put monkeys into 3 conditions. The control condition, so nothing happens. In the next condition, they show them, so these are monkeys that live in a lab. They don't live in the wild. In the other condition, they show a scary snake video. And when I say scary, what I mean is it's a video of another monkey being scared of a snake. Running away from a snake. The third condition, they show a scary flower video. So it's actually the same video, but they edit it such that the monkey is running away from a flower. So those are the 3 conditions. In the control condition, the monkeys are not afraid of snakes. If they've never had any interaction with a snake, they don't have fear of snakes. If you show the monkey this video, it learns to be afraid of snakes. So now the behaviorists are very happy. Aha, see? It's all the environment. Genes play no role. But, not so fast, if you show them the same video, but it's of a monkey being afraid of a flower, the monkeys do not learn to be afraid of flowers. What this shows is there are some kinds of stimuli that they are biologically prepared to be afraid of, but that still has to be elicited from the environment. So they are biologically ready to be afraid of things like snakes and spiders, but not things like flowers. Okay. The next pair of terms is a little boring, but don't worry. The fun stuff is at the end of the chapter. That's where the sex and violence stuff is, the stuff people are interested in. Not in the same area, but one section on sex, one section about violence. But before that, there are 2 different ways that species can become similar or have similar traits. Homology and analogy. So homo means same, right? You all can make a connection there. Homology is a way, if you want to put it this way, that the animals are more similar. Here's what I mean by that. Homology is where 2 species share a trait because the common ancestor had that trait. So one example in the book is humans and chimpanzees have similar kinds of smiles that serve similar functions. And we likely do because we share a common ancestor that probably also had those kinds of smiles. So that's an example of homologous evolution. But there are other situations where 2 species arrive at the same trait independently, meaning the common ancestor did not have that trait. So for example, eyes have evolved, I think about 20 times independently in the history of evolution. Many people say, oh, something as complex as the eye could never evolve. Darwin, in his book, actually outlined a pretty simple step-by-step way in which the eye can evolve, and it's been well confirmed since then. And we get it happening, as I say, separate times in the history of evolution. So if 2 species both have eyes, but their common ancestor didn't have eyes, that means it evolved independently. So that's an example of evolution by analogy, not similarity is due to analogy, not homology. So as I mentioned, the book uses chimps and humans' smiles as an example of homology. So chimps have 2 different smiles. One is the greeting smile, which is a less intense smile, if you like. So the eyes don't change as much, just kind of like this. And that is just a way of saying, I'm safe, I'm not threatening, I'm not going to fight you. The open mouth smile, which is often associated with the chimp doing something that kind of sounds like laughing, is when chimps are play fighting, especially when they're young. It serves a similar function, but it's used not during a greeting, but during a kind of play fighting activity. And it's again communicating, look, I know we're just play fighting. I'm not actually going to start beating you up. And so humans also have distinct smiles. So when the eyes crinkle more, mouth is open, or you're laughing, it's similar to the chimpanzee open mouth smile. Okay, so the next section is on the evolution of sexual behavior and sexual desire. So to start off with, the connection between evolution and sexual desire, if you think about it for a second, is pretty obvious. The way to put it bluntly is that any organism that had no sexual desire did not leave any descendants. So there's an over evolutionary time, strong selection pressure for sexual desire. Now, what many people think when they hear that is, well, what about people with homosexual attraction? So a certain percentage of the population is homosexual. Just hold that thought. We return to it in chapter 11, and I'll talk about some of the different evolutionary hypotheses that have been put forward. But certainly in the vast majority of cases, people have at least some heterosexual attraction, and there's a very straightforward evolutionary story to tell there. One theory that's been used to explain a lot of patterns in this area is parental investment theory. This has been applied both to humans and to other animals. This is, in part, an attempt to explain why males and females are different. So, in humans and in other species, males are on average larger, more aggressive, other differences that we'll talk about. Why is that? As I say, it exists in other mammalian species too. The answer that parental investment theory gives is that there is a different minimum level of parental investment. By minimum level of parental investment, I mean, what's the smallest amount of investment that the organism has to put into the offspring in order for the offspring to survive? So, in the case of females, the minimum investment it varies from species to species, but in humans, probably a matter of years, like 9 months, so especially in the context in which we evolved. There's 9 months of pregnancy and some period of breastfeeding and weaning after that. So there's a large amount of minimal parental investment. I don't want to try to be funny, but can anyone tell me, what's the minimum amount of investment that a male has to make in order for the child to survive? Anyone want to say? Someone in my Tuesday class said 10 seconds. So that's maybe sometimes true, but so the answer is not very much, right? Obviously, there is less amount of investment that the male has to make in order for the kid to survive. Now, in species like humans, males typically invest more than that, but there is a difference, as I say, in the minimum amount. To say a bit more about this, I have a video from the psychologist Paul Bloom. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful. There have been some interesting attempts to test the predictions of parental investment theory. So remember, in science, you have to generate predictions. One thing that Bloom mentioned in passing is that it's not the case that in all species the child grows inside the female's body. There are some species of seahorse, for example, where the male still generates sperm, but they have something like a pouch in which the baby grows, or whatever the term for a young seahorse is. And so therefore the males in that species have a larger amount of minimum parental investment. The prediction you'd make based on this theory is that in that species, the females should be larger and more aggressive and compete for mates, and that's what you find. So that's a confirmed prediction from this theory. It's tougher in humans because, of course, we have the confounding variable of cultural influences on sexual behavior, but they did once do a study. It's one of those studies that you can't believe they got away with doing. You might not get away with doing it today. They sent out a group of attractive males and attractive females into a university campus and told them to approach random people of the opposite sex and say the following. They would say, oh, hello, my name is so-and-so. I've been seeing you around campus. I find you very attractive. And they would ask one of three questions. They would ask different questions to different people they approached. They would ask, will you go to dinner with me tonight? Will you go back to my apartment tonight? Or will you go to bed with me tonight? So as I say, may not get away with this today for an honors project or something. And then they looked at how females and males responded to this. So when females were approached by a good-looking guy asking them to dinner, anyone want to guess? What percentage of them said yes? No one wants to guess? So the answer is 50%. You know, that's pretty good, right? It's a good-looking guy. For apartment, less than 10% said yes. And for will you go to bed with me, not a single woman in the sample said yes. Come on, I need more information. The males is where it gets very depressing. So 50% say yes to dinner, so the same number. For apartment, it was over 60%. And for bed, 75% said yes. So, which is what you would predict, right? So, given that, as Paul Bloom said in the video, short-term sexual encounters are more costly for a woman. She's going to be stuck with the genes or stuck with the kid. And it need not be the case that anyone's consciously thinking that. It's just that over evolutionary time, there's selection pressure to be more choosy about, a casual sexual encounter. The logic is, hey, they better be some good genes, if you're not sticking around. It's a funny study to read. At the end, they include some comments from people who were approached, and you got very different comments. So the females in the bed condition would say things like, what's wrong with you? Please get away from me. Whereas the males would say things like, why would we wait until tonight? So, I was once talking with a girl I was seeing, and I told her a sexist joke that someone had said at work. And she was like, that's terrible, men shouldn't speak that way about women. And I said, oh, that's a good point, but, I'm sure when you're with your girlfriends, you probably say, like, men are pigs and stuff like that. And she said, no, that's different. That's okay, because men are pigs. And this study may have vindicated her a little bit. Now, crucially, this plays itself out differently in different species. So there are different, what the book calls mating systems. By far the two most common are polygyny and monogamy. And these differences will be different levels of extremeness depending on which mating system it is. So poly means many, gene relates to woman or female. So in animals with a polygynous mating systems, the high status males will have many female partners, and some males will have no partners. In species like that, there is more intense male-male competition for reasons that should make sense. So one extreme case of this is the bull elephant seal, where one male can have a harem of around 50 females. So there's very intense male-male competition, and the males are around 5 times as big as the females, because over time there's been pressure to be better at fighting each other. And to show you the beauty and majesty of nature, I have some footage of a bull seal fight. So that's an extreme case of the first so the second system is monogamy. This is more common in species where the child is very vulnerable and needs more round-the-clock investment. So many bird species are like this. The male and the female pair bond and team up to raise and invest in the offspring. It need not mean, and typically doesn't mean like lifelong monogamy. It may just mean for a particular mating season, but this results in less male-male competition, and therefore less difference between the males and the females. So some penguin species are monogamous in this sense, and there's less difference in size between the males and females. They're harder to distinguish by eyesight, just by looking at them. So one good proxy for how monogamous or polygynous a species is to look at how much bigger the males are than the females. Another system, which is rare in mammals, but bees are like this, for example, is polyandry. So andros means male, so this is systems with one female and many males. So I don't know if there are any cases of that in mammals, but some other types of species have this. And then one other one, which is given different names in different books, but this book calls it promiscuity. In these species, everyone mates with everyone. So low choosiness across the board. One example is actually a close relative of ours, the bonobos. How many of you know about bonobos? So it's weird more people don't know, but the chimpanzees for some reason are more famous. So we split from chimpanzees about 7 million years ago, and then bonobos and chimpanzees split here. So we're actually equally closely related to both. Chimpanzees are more aggressive than bonobos. Bonobos are a kind of hippie species. They live by, make love, not war. That's their philosophy. If two groups of male bonobos appear like they want to fight, like they're getting ready to go at it, the females will mate with the males until they no longer want to fight. So that's their, which works, by the way. It does prevent the conflict. So the first two are more common, but these also exist. Any questions about the different mating systems? So the question, of course, that people then wonder about, and the book has a section on this, is what are humans like? Where do we fall on this? And the answer is humans are largely monogamous, but a bit polyandrous. If you look anthropologically and historically, most humans pair bond and jointly invest in offspring, but many societies, especially more traditional ones, do have some degree of polyandry, where you'll have high status males with a large number of females assigned to them. And this probably goes back into our evolutionary past, and one way to think about it is the degree of size difference. Males are slightly larger, nothing like the bull elephant seal, but about 15 to 20% larger on average. And as I say, most people pair bond, and there's an interesting paper that I won't test you on, but it's called The Ape That Thought It Was a Peacock, and the subtitle is How Evolutionary Psychology Exaggerates Sex Differences. And it talks about how if you look carefully, both males and females, especially for long-term mating, are both highly choosy in humans. So we're not as extreme as something like the bull seal. And one thing to think about in that context, and this is potentially controversial, but if you look at peacocks, for example, and other species where the males compete a lot, the males are much more beautiful and the females are very plain because the females are much choosier in those species. Is that what humans are like? I want someone other than me to say it. Well, I mean, I may be biased, but I don't think it's shouldn't be too controversial to say that females are the more kind of decorative species, which indicates that both sexes compete for mates, and then males are choosy, especially for long-term type mating. Another application of this that the book talks about is jealousy. This is a topic about which evolutionary psychologists actually made a prediction in advance. So the evolutionary psychologist David Buss. And before describing the result, I want you to, we'll do a little activity. I want you to imagine two different cases. So imagine you have a long-term partner, and in one case, your partner has a one-night stand with someone else. So they have sex with someone else, but they don't really care about this person, and suppose that you know for sure they'll never see that person again. So that's one scenario. In the other scenario, I don't know how to write this down, but they are spending more time with someone else. They're going to the movies with them all the time. Maybe have a bit of a crush on them, but there will be no sex. And let's say you know for sure, for some reason, that this person spent lots of time with them, but you know that there will be no sex. Show of hands. You don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to, but who would, just think, which would make you more jealous? And assume in both cases that your partner is spending more time with someone of the opposite sex. Who would be more jealous if this happened? Who would be more jealous if this happened? So only a few people are willing to raise their hands, but so here's the prediction that David Buss made. He predicted that on average, males will be more likely to say they're jealous about this, whereas females on average will be more likely to say they're jealous of this. The evolutionary logic is, if you're a male and your partner has sex with someone else, you may then be wasting your resources because you may be investing in someone else's genes, so to speak. Whereas if you're a female and a man, your partner mates with someone else, that's bad. Both sexes will be jealous of both events, but as long as he is still investing in your offspring, you're mostly okay. Again, I'm not saying morally okay. Obviously, don't deceive your partners. But as a descriptive scientific matter, it's more of a problem if the man is not investing in your offspring and is falling in love with someone else and directing resources elsewhere. So that was the reason he made his prediction, and then he did the analysis, and that is what you find. As one of my professors put it, when a woman gives birth and looks at the baby, she knows that's her kid. The man, he hopes. Hence the difference in types of sexual jealousy. Another important study about human mating preferences, also done by David Buss. This is one of the largest studies ever done in psychology. They looked at 10,000 people from, I think it was, 30 countries, and just asked them, what do you look for in a long-term partner? And he did this to test different predictions that he as kind of a nice note, males and females agree on the top three. The top three things cross-culturally that people look for in a mate are kindness, intelligence, and exciting personality. So that's kind of nice. But if you move down the list, you did find, or Buss found differences in the direction that he predicted. Males on average care more about attractiveness than females do, and females care more about earning potential cross-culturally than males do. Now they're not the top three, but their position on the list is different. Another difference that was found cross-culturally is age preferences. Males cross-culturally preferred a woman on average 2 years younger than them, and females on average preferred someone 2 years older than them. The reason Buss predicted this, you can think about it in the following way. Males can more or less take, well, who do I start with? Males can more or less take for granted that the females will invest in the kid because they, in a certain sense, don't have a choice, like once they're pregnant, in the context in which we evolved anyways. Whereas females cannot take that for granted. They can't take for granted that the male will invest. All of you know from being alive, sometimes the man does not invest in the offspring. And so cues that the man is both able to invest and willing to invest matter. So there's some funny studies finding that looking at women find a picture of a man more attractive if he's having a positive interaction with a child. Indications like that are taken as attractive, and any indication that he has the ability and wherewithal to invest. Why the male preference for females that are slightly younger? The female can take for granted that the male can impregnate them, more or less. Males, as you all know, can produce babies almost until they die, whereas for females there's a limited window in which it's possible, so you do find these age preferences cross-culturally. Okay, that's all the information in the section on sexual preferences. Any questions before moving on to aggression and related topics? So evolution is a competitive process. So the capacity for aggression exists in many species. In species like social mammals that are more intelligent, one solution to avoiding too much damage from aggressive behavior is dominance hierarchies. So imagine, two animals both come near food and they both want it and they fight over it. Even if you're the animal that wins the fight, that's costly, right? You take damage to get the food, even if you're the one that wins. So in animals that are smart enough to look at another animal and try and get a sense of how strong and tough they are, dominance hierarchies emerge. So they both size each other up, and you can think of a dominance hierarchy as the hierarchy of who would win in a fight. So that way both sides save the trouble of actually fighting and taking damage. So this is a more efficient way of allocating resources. So that's one kind of aggression. So aggression between animals, like to get resources or mates. One specific kind of aggression that is very rare is what we might colloquially call war. And by war, I mean an event in which groups, so I'm using war as kind of a technical term, groups of unrelated males engage in lethal violence, so they kill organisms against other groups of unrelated males in the same species. So groups of males fighting other groups of males, and it's not groups of cousins or brothers, just teams, where they're not genetically related, killing other people in other groups of unrelated males in the same species. There are only two species that do this: humans and chimpanzees. Probably not a coincidence that the chimps are our closest relatives. So that's a specific kind of aggression that's very rare. Okay, so those are some facts about aggression. What about niceness? So the chapter ends with a discussion of niceness. Niceness is, when you first think about it, without the benefit of theory, it seems surprising that niceness would exist, that it would be produced by evolution, because as I said, evolution is a competitive process. It's about organisms getting their genes into the next generation, not helping some other guy spread his genes. And yet, many species do engage in cooperative and even sometimes self-sacrificial behavior. So, why is that? One reason, this one's pretty easy to understand, is cooperation. So cooperation is where two animals help each other out, and they both benefit in the short term. So like a pack of wolves hunting a large animal, so they are cooperating, they're helping each other, get the animal, but they all benefit. They all get the nice big meal at the end. So no real mystery there. If it's mutually beneficial, you don't need, or it makes sense how that would evolve through natural selection. Species in which this type of behavior exists have a kind of rudimentary sense of fairness. They're unhappy if some members of the group are not helping out, but still reaping the benefits. And a funny example of this is a study done of monkeys, where it was shown that monkeys are very unhappy if they are not paid fairly for their work. So actually, you'll see someone giving the talk, it's like a TED talk, and then you'll see footage of a graduate student actually doing the experiment. That person is Sarah Brosnan. She was a graduate student at the time. She wound up becoming a professor at the place I did my master's at Georgia State University. But the end result of this study is quite funny. Okay, so that's cooperation. As I say, that's easier to explain. What's harder to explain is altruism. Altruism is where an organism helps another organism out and it costs them. They're not both benefiting in the short term. One organism is paying a cost to help someone else. So that's harder to explain. And there are two different theories. Probably both of these processes are at work in humans. The first is kin selection. So kin is just an old-fashioned term for family. So the idea here is you are more likely, well, let me put it this way, genes that predispose you to helping organisms you're related to are more likely to get passed on. So your siblings, for example, share half of your genes. Your cousins share 12.5% of your genes, and so on. One simple case of kin selection leading to altruistic behavior is investment in children, right? So, not in all species, but in most mammals, I guess all mammals, because it means species that do things like breastfeed, the parents, sometimes just the mother, sometimes both, will invest in the offspring, and they'll engage in self-sacrificial behavior to increase their children's chance of surviving. And the reason is the kids share half their genes. And the same logic would apply to other family members. Now again, remember the distinction between proximate and ultimate explanation. It's not that parents are consciously thinking, yes, I love Timmy and will help Timmy because it will increase my chance of spreading my genes. That's not the idea. The idea is that genes which predispose you to loving your kids or your siblings or what have you increased in frequency over time because of kin selection. Okay, but what about niceness to unrelated organisms? There, the most influential theory is reciprocal altruism. This is, I scratch your back, you scratch mine later. So I'll be self-sacrificial for you today if you're having a bad time, but when I'm having a bad time, I expect you to do this for me. So one species in which this exists is vampire bats. Vampire bats are very nice, not to the goats and cows they suck blood from, but to each other. If one vampire bat has a good night, gets a lot of blood, it shares the blood with the other vampire bats if they had a bad night. Aw, so nice. But if one of the vampire bats doesn't share back when they have a good night, they'll shun that one. They're like, hey, you had a good night and now you're not helping. We're not sharing with you anymore. So as a result, this latter type of selection only takes place in species that are intelligent enough to recognize people and remember who helped them in the past and who didn't. There's an argument to be made that one of the main drivers of human intelligence is the need for social reasoning. If you look at us in relation to other primates, there's a pretty close correlation between the size of the groups that the primates live in and the size of the cortex, such that the primates with the bigger social group, and therefore more of a need to remember, who's been nice and who hasn't, have bigger brains. Humans, of course, have both the biggest brains and the biggest social groups, even in the hunter-gatherer context. Okay. Any questions about cooperation and altruism? Okay, I'll leave you all with, oh wow, I could have given you all a longer break. I'm sure you won't be too sad about leaving early, but I'll leave you all with one closing thought. And that's a quote from Darwin that, strangely enough, has been very helpful to me. At the end of The Descent of Man, Darwin says that we bear in our bodily frame the stamp of our lowly origin. The stamp of our lowly origin. In other words, we are animals and it shows. Here's just a little thought. When you fail, it's okay. You're only a half chromosome away from a chimpanzee. Don't beat yourself up. And if you succeed, just be amazed by that. You're like, wow, I have a half chromosome from a chimpanzee and I succeeded. And I know what your question's going to be. I just realized, because you remember last time, I forgot to tell you about the written. So the written, because next week is test. Is that what you were going to ask? Yeah. So he's the remember the written guy. So next week is the test. The written question will be about the 4 lobes and one other brain area. So I will describe some kind of activity. So someone making a pie, whatever, something that people could do. And you'll have to describe how each of the 4 lobes could contribute to that behavior. Plus one other brain area that'll be a surprise. So that's incentive to study the other brain areas. And another reminder, tomorrow is test review day. So for 1100, that's from 1 to 2:30. So if you didn't do as well on test 1, go through the key terms and bring any questions tomorrow. Okay. I'll stick around if you have questions. I'll see some of you tomorrow and the rest of you next week for the test. Please bring a pencil and your student ID.